Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States Ask the Expert webinar series. I'm Amy Carter. I'm the Vice President of Member Services and Business Development here at Discus. We are recording this webinar, so it'll be available later. And might hear some dings because we'll be inviting people from the lobby into the actual session. And while we're doing that, we open each webinar and each event that we do with a reminder of the Discus antitrust policy statement. So, Thomas, if I can ask you to just advance the slide so people can see the statement as well, but I'll read it. So we ask that everyone refrain from discussing or exchanging information relating to pricing, to marketing or sales plans, cost or confidential plans regarding output or production, to refrain from talking about boycotting another company or recruiting or hiring others' employees' salaries or wages or benefits, or any other competitively sensitive or business proprietary information. So with that, as our members know, as Discus members know, we are the leading voice and advocate for the distilled spirits industry. We also provide a wealth of education, resources, and services to members and to the broader industry, including this webinar series, which this Ask the Experts webinar series aims to bring relevant discussions to Discus members and to the broader industry. Our speaker today is Thomas Paulson. He's Director of Research at Placer AI. He'll share some data on consumer trends across hospitality, retail, and BevAlc specifically. And for all you Big Ten fans, I learned this the other day, Thomas is a Badger and a Gopher. And he let me know, I knew what a Badger was, which is University of Wisconsin. But Thomas, remind me, Gopher?
University of Minnesota, Twin Cities.
Minnesota, right. Okay, fantastic. The way the series will work, the way this webinar will work is that Thomas and I will have a conversation for about 30 minutes. I want to encourage the audience to ask questions along the way, but we'll also leave time at the end of our conversation to take questions specifically. And if you'd like to ask a question, there's a raise your hand icon that kind of looks like this at the top of your screen, or you can put questions in the chat. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started, Thomas and I. And I just want to start with saying earlier this year, I think it was in January, Thomas, I think you joined us and shared insights about 2023, the last quarter of 2023, and looking into what those might portend for 2024. But for people who weren't able to join us in January at the earlier webinar, could you maybe start with what is Placer AI, the company, how you get your data, and those kinds of things. And then we can dive into 2024 consumer trends.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so this is going to be a very macro discussion. Our data allows you to get quite micro, and that was a little bit about the January presentation when we kind of summarized that the end of last year ended strong and that this start of 2024 was likely going to be a little bit softer, given the payback for an jubilant holiday period. In terms of our data, what we mean by contextualized foot traffic data is we see millions of smartphones on a pretty persistent basis for a good level of duration, so a signal lasts about a year. We see that phones, because there's an app on the phone or an individual has opted in to have their location tracked because they get a benefit for that. So an example would be Fitbit or Apple Watch. You want your steps counted so that you can have your calories counted. You want your sleep measured to see if you're closed your circles. Or if you have, say, auto from Progressive or Allstate, they give you a 10% discount to your policy price because they can better understand what type of driver you are, what kind of risk you are, and so they can better price that policy relative to the risk. and they'll share some of that benefit in pricing with the user by the 10% discount. So we have partnerships with hundreds of apps where we um, try to have a census level profile of visitation to most venues. And where a device resides from 11 to 5, we tie to a census block. So that would give us the average age, the average income, home value, whether they went to college, and that's census data. There's another 27 partners that we have that also aggregate data at a census level. So we don't see any individual per se in terms of their home location. We only see the census block. At that census block level, we aggregate and randomize the signals, but that's okay. So we can see in terms of context, in terms of a retailer, restaurant, theme park, et cetera, what that audience, what that visitor mix looks like and how that's changing over time. And so the example I have up on stage or on the screen here is the Jack Daniel's Distillery Center. Um, and for, visiting a distillery to kind of divine who's going there. It's only a visitor, it's not a worker, it's only during the opening hours. And I want someone who's trying to understand the brand, the provenance. So I'm only looking for visits for that are 30 minutes or longer. And so you on the top of the screen right here, you'll see what you would see in, say, Google Maps, and then in the bottom is what it looks like in our platform. And so what across all of the structures that we consider a distillery, as part of the distillery visit, we've created what's a geofence and then a phone, a smartphone that goes in there and out of there and stays for at least 30 minutes, counts as one visit. So it's pretty rich data. It goes back to January 1st, 2017. This is, our data has a 3-day latency, meaning that I can see what today being Tuesday, what happened on Sunday or Saturday at least. And this is visitation by day to Jack Daniel's over the past year. And you can see, they kind of around 600, 700,000 or 600 to 700 visitors per day. And then over the last year, there were about 166,000 visits. And the average stay there was 65 minutes. So that's our data. All good?
Yes, yeah. I think
Okay,
that's
so we can go back to, our data goes back to January 1st, 2017. So this is doing the similar to what we did with Jack Daniels, but for all the destination distilleries in Kentucky. So you got 19, 22, 23, in 24, the early, and it's you can see, it started, pretty good and has remained fairly good going through the end of April, and this is in the first week of May. So this is rolling 4 weeks in terms of thousands of visits uh, to the 11 or 12 distilleries that I note here. Um, and so you can see, a pretty happy story there. You can do a
Hey,
similar
Thomas, can
thing.
you hold on a
Yeah,
second?
yeah,
There was a question in the chat on slide 5, so maybe go back, looks like 1. How is the average time spent captured when
because
you're looking at mobile data?
the device goes in, stays there, and goes out. So when it goes in and then stays there and comes out, that counts as a visit. So that's the durability of the signal. So, or that's the duration of the stay. Yep.
Thanks.
So you can filter for all. You could look at for folks that stayed there for a half an hour, 2 hours, different intents with each of those durations. So, and that actually gets to this one right here, which I'm showing. This is a nightlife district in Long Beach. And so I'm trying to understand people going out to restaurants, uh, nightclubs, bars. And so to me, that's, somebody who's going to this district Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, 6 to midnight, and that stayed for an hour. So, not somebody who's just picking up a to-go order, or that's, someone who came in at 5 o'clock to buy a pair of jeans. It's really, that nightlife activity. And what I'm showing you here is the summer months. And so visitors in 19 were 5,000. Then it went in as we came out of the pandemic, 137, and then 23 up again, 151, and the average stay there being about 2 hours. So, I characterize this as people having fun. And as you'll see in my presentation, I characterize 2023. 2022 was a weird year. So kind of coming out of the pandemic. 2023 was really what I call the celebration year, or the year of peak more fun. Um, so that's kind of our data. And then, you can look at this in terms of other districts. So this is 23 larger nightlife districts around the United States, and I've selected those by them being more regional or local visits to a district versus a region where there's a lot of visitation from out of market, like Vegas and the Strip. And so this is what it looks like, similar to the Long Beach, but for all of these districts. So blue being pre-pandemic, then 22, 23, and then 24. And then you can see 23, we're up on 22 and we're up on 19. Part of that increase is obviously people having more fun, but also, somewhat that the districts that we have selected here, some districts are doing quite well relative to 19, because nightlife and districts of nightlife have changed as well. But in 24, you can see 24, we came in soft beginning of the year. Some of that is the weather impact. And then as you see in March and in April, we're down on last year just simply because last year was peak more fun. And I think we have a normalization that's going on. In addition to, I think we have another downshift by the less affluent consumer, which we'll talk about in the presentation here. So,
And Thomas, the red line is 2024, right?
correct.
So
Yeah.
that's why it looks soft. Okay, yeah. And then sort
Yep.
of normalizing. Got it.
Yeah. And we'll come back to this in a minute. So, 23, 24 consumer trends. So kind of touching on a few big ones. So, um, over the last couple years, there's really what I call four big shocks to retail and off-prem, and to a specific degree, over those being high inflation essentials, recessionary fears, consumers preferencing experiences over goods. So I call this more fun versus more stuff. Return to office, which we kind of touched on in January and previously. So I'm going to pass on that one. But so just to level set for everyone, this is looking at the largest producers in the industry and their organic growth for North America or the US as it's disclosed. Um, and It's a little bit noisy. I apologize. Remy and Diageo only report results for every 6 months. Pernod Ricard is generous and reports for every 3 months. Brown-Forman is a little bit of a different fiscal calendar, and so they haven't reported uh, really what would be an equivalent Q1 period. But the things that I would kind of highlight here, so, Pernod Ricard, call them on a dollar organic growth up about 20% versus pre-pandemic. Um, Brown-Forman a little bit less than that. Remy, which is heavy levered to cognac, really down hard, which cognac, is really having a heck of a hangover. And then Diageo about, call it, low 40s up versus pre-pandemic. Diageo breaks its business or its results down between volume and price mix. And, so volume is for Diageo is up a little bit versus pre-pandemic, really where the driver really was price mix. We'll talk about the category more. And part of that is their portfolio changes and into what I call premium plus liquids, which which really were levered to mix, if you will, during the pandemic. So this is just kind of get everybody on the same page in terms of, we've got a lot of price mix into the growth in the industry growth versus pre-pandemic, is up solidly. And then so we'll kind of go into how the components to that growth here. Um, so just kind of going into those four big impacts to consumer expenditure and discretionary spending. This is a slide that I've shared before. This is looking at spending on off-prem food and bev, so call it grocery stores and discount stores versus restaurants. So this is just, in or off-prem food and beverage. And, there was some pricing in spirits industry, but there was really massive pricing in what I call shelf stable food, produce, pack or processed food, to the degree of mid 30s. And so I call that, empty calorie inflation spending, and that's the light blue. So this is the nominal dollars. And then the dark blue here is really real spending, or it's spending using 2020 or 2017 dollars. So really no inflation affecting that. So calories are up a little bit. A little bit of that is channel a share of stomach from out of home back to in home, but a large part of it is just a lot of inflation. And then if you sum it up, it was about $290 billion in inflation that took away from discretionary spending, or about 1.85% of PCE, just massive. And I think, all of us are aware of grocery prices, so no surprise here. The way we see it in our data, that was BEA's, of the Bureau of Economic Analysis, that's government data. This is looking at our data. So this is where people are shopping, and year-on-year change in the traffic to different types of retailers. So in the beginning of 22, we began to see consumers move into grocery outlet, to food for less, all these, and shift out of Sprouts and Kroger's and Albertsons. And that shift in channel to value channels built all the way through 22. And then when we got to 23, it compounded on itself. So it built, and as we got into 24, it continues to compound. So this is households changing where they shop, changing their behavior to stretch the dollars to get the calories that they need. So that food inflation is causing stress on budgets and stress on households because people are changing their behavior. Then this is looking, just as of late, and Trader Joe's and Aldi's is in terms of visitors or people shopping there, up about 20-25% year on year. So really massive shifts into Aldi's and Trader Joe's um, brands, and their retailer brands, which effectively are private label. And so really food inflation and the absolute level of food prices, consumers are very sensitive to it because they're buying groceries daily, weekly, bi-monthly, et cetera. So it's very visible. And so this whole dynamic and whole sentiment around inflation, in my mind, will continue to be a factor in consumer sentiment and spending until you see this normalized, meaning that we are not doing these large shifts in channel into value, and that things will begin to stabilize. There's another dynamic that's affecting grocery, which is this is captured in this one. So people are shopping more banners, and people are shopping around. They're looking for hot promotions and cherry picking those promotions. They're looking for the best value that each retailer brings to the table, if you will. And so and they're also trying to balance out those high grocery prices with their paychecks. So you have more of a paycheck cycle. So what this is saying, in the May of 22, that and this is kind of real dollars. There's no inflation in here. The spend per visit for grocery was on a monthly basis, or sorry, on per visit was, like, call it 385, and that's moved down to like 315. And so that's just more visits, diluting the number of the dollars spent on any given visit. And so this is a really significant dynamic that's happened over this last year, is multiple banners, shopping multiple banners to try to find the best value. So it's not just grocery that people change where they shopped and consumer shopping behaviors. In what I call discretionary goods, we also see that. So Macy's and Dillard's in the beginning, or really in fourth quarter of 22, we saw middle and lower income consumers really disengage from that retail category or channel. And as we went through 23, we saw, more of those consumers moving out of that, but it was the actually higher income households beginning to also shift out into brands known for value or treasure hunt value, which is Marshalls and Ross. So, lower income, middle income consumers began to move, but then higher income consumers began to shift into these treasure hunt value names because even if someone had money, they wanted to be seen as smart with their dollars and thrifty. So my joke of it is that when food inflation is hot, treasure hunt value is in style and thriftiness is in style. So that's kind of the dynamic of inflation and fears of recession. As I mentioned earlier, 23 was the year really of peak more fun across categories. So you had theme parks, you had events up, you had concerts up. We all remember Beyonce's and Taylor Swift's tours, and then for the affluent, it was really off to international destination travel and spending there versus spending at home. So the way we see this data, this is looking at say national parks. So this is Rocky Mountain National Park, which is a destination theme park. So people are coming out of Colorado to visit. And you could see here in 19, we had 201,000 visits over the summer. And then that was up in 22 to 215, and then up again in 23. So people are really moving, out of their region to really, extend their vacations and to see the sights, if you will. This is Expedia, the online booking company, and this is looking at their lodging bookings and looking at lodging bookings this year or the growth this year versus the growth last year, the year of peak more fun. So in Q1 of 23, their bookings were up $3.3 billion, or up 19% year on year. This year in 24, when you're competing or you're comparing to that more fun, you're up. People are having more fun, but it's only 4% growth, or only a quarter of what it was in the base period. So this is a way of understanding, this dynamic where you had a lot more spending on fun in 23, and that came out of, less spending on stuff because people had to make choices, and they chose to have more fun versus buying more fun last year. But this year we're seeing, more moderate growth. So, spending and fun are a bit more balanced. This
Thomas,
is
do
like,
you know how that compares with like pre-pandemic? Is that still normalizing? Like
yeah,
this,
we're
the
normalizing. So
Q4,
24 is, well, 23 was
2024?
kind of normalizing, and 24 is now normal.
Okay,
So normal for them would be somewhere between 4 to 6% growth.
got it. Okay,
But we have this big base period, so the comp is a little bit challenged.
right.
This is looking at the Vegas strips for people who visited Q1 this year, 24 versus Q1 of 13, and visits are down a little bit, and visitors are down a little bit. So last year, really big year for Vegas in terms of people going out of their home markets to a destination place to have a lot more fun. So more moderate this year. And this is consistent with how MGM and other of the operators in Vegas have reported their results, Caesars, MGM, et cetera. Then this is looking at on-premises expenditures for food and beverage. So restaurants, uh, nightclubs, bars, both food and beverage. And this is just looking at real consumer expenditure. So no inflation in these numbers. We all know that grocery or that restaurant prices are up a lot. So 2024, we are up only 15 billion on an annualized rate versus 59 versus 100. So people, were more comfortable going to restaurants and bars in first quarter of
Mm.
22. and then as we obviously went out to, destinations, international travel, so less in 23, but you can see that 15 versus 100 or the 15 versus, 60, we're running about a quarter of last year's year-on-year growth. So again, just making the point that 23 was peak more fun. So going to, nightlife. So we going back to this slide we had. So that more fun, right? That's that green line, right? Off like a rocket ship versus 19 versus 22. And then we have this, softer patch that we're starting right here, which we're going to talk a little bit about, but it's just kind of, again, it's kind of understanding the kind of the macro dynamics. This is looking at of that index, you got the Second Street, which I showed, earlier. This is 6 other districts that are within that index. So in the case, say, East Williamsburg and Brooklyn, up nicely. Now we begin to soften a little bit versus, obviously very seasonal, with the summer months being very strong. Fulton Market in Chicago still up strong, but a little bit leveling out. Texas down. Nashville down, or flat to last year, down versus 19. South Beach, down quite a bit. Florida was really a 22 and a 23 story. And, people have, went there, they had that when they wanted to go do something else these days. And then Long Beach, here you can see that we're starting to flatten out. And, obviously, the seasonality, given weather and other dynamics, every neighborhood or every district has its own nuances. You can see here at Long Beach that the, Christmas and New Year's are quite vibrant in contrast to the other districts. So that kind of gives you a,
Hey,
yep.
Thomas, before you move on, we do have a question.
Yep.
Wayne, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question? Okay, well, maybe,
Or maybe you could type it in and then you
yeah,
could
Wayne, if you
read
can't
it.
unmute yourself and you can't ask the question, maybe type, oh, here we go. Are we tracking secondary markets?
Yeah, you can track any market you want.
But
I'm showing you
do you, Paul, Thomas, do you have data on secondary markets?
yeah,
I don't think we have it
it's
in this
like
presentation,
I
but
don't yeah, we have data on every market. So if Wayne wants to give me, 6 markets, 6 districts to look at, I'm happy to do that. Don't have those live right
yeah,
now.
right.
But yes, we can track any district, any region, any neighborhood, any retail venue in the United States.
So for the ones that you have here, Thomas, these 6 here, what's the sample size?
Oh, these are
Which is
huge.
Wayne's second
So like,
question.
yeah, I mean, so you're looking, so, we sampled millions of devices in the United States. So in Nashville, right, I'm estimating about 170,000 visits in a month, uh, that for folks that have come Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, 6 to midnight, that have stayed for an hour. So, the Gulch, much larger, say, than Long Beach, which is 75,000 monthly visits, and then Miami 225, uh, East Williamsburg 280, etc. Does that make sense?
Yep,
Does that
yep.
answer the
And
question?
Thomas, you'll get to, yeah, Wayne says thank you. He hit the nail on the head. Great. But I have a question for you. So you'll get to, so it looks like in the fall for most areas,
Mm-hmm.
except for maybe Chicago, I think it is, have sort of trended downward. Summer, like you said, looks, pretty good for most areas, most regions. Were you going to shift to what this data tells us about, yeah, okay, going into 2024 and looking into
Yeah,
the
we'll get there. This is
second
kind
half of
of
the
just
year?
yeah, we kind of level set on, I don't have data for the second half of 2024
Of
because
course.
the second half of 2024 hasn't
No crystal
happened.
ball, but
No crystal ball. It's just kind of layering out, kind of the trends that we see, and then, kind of how that then gets, packed into kind of what are dominant trends this year that are going to play through, likely to play through in the second half. If we look at another category, just wine, this is looking at two kind of, I'd say, regional areas for wine where you have more, a lot of weekend visitors. Like for those who don't remember, Solvang is in Santa Barbara. It's one of the sideways destinations of that movie, and Temecula, brings a lot of people from Orange County and San Diego. And what I'm showing you here is, that, yeah, 2023, kind of bounced around similar to 19, but 2024 is definitely down. So, you know, this is a dynamic where that, inflation in essentials, we already had more fun, so we have a softer year. Um, so when we think about the second half, so to your question, so these are what I'd say is second half considerations. Now, I do a lot of work around consumer spending and economics, and then so this highlight right here, that's a link to my weekly that I write. So some of what we touched on earlier in terms of that food inflation is going to affect the second half, the search for value and saving, and looking for ways to spend less or less of your dollars. Those are all dynamics that are going to play into the second half. And then there's a lot more in terms of the work that we've done in terms of contextualizing that. But really, the demand engagement is there it's there. I mean, we are seeing an engagement and demand, but it's there for value. The less affluent is under pressure, as I shared earlier, in terms of that food inflation. But then this year, we're seeing a lot of inflation in what I call essential services, home, auto, and health insurance, and that's burning through the remaining excess savings from that were built up during the pandemic, in higher tiers of consumer incomes, or the middle or middle plus incomes. Are fewer and fewer excess savings, and that's creating less discretionary spending for fun or goods. The higher income consumer is out and spending, but they want value for their dollars, and value isn't price, it's what you get for your dollars. And so within the spirits category, as I touched on in that first level set thing, you know, category mix still has room to probably normalize lower for the spirits category. Um, Also in terms of peak more fun, more fun versus more spending, part of the issue with the industry and imbalances in inventory at wholesalers and retailers is just not understanding how to plan for a pandemic recovery, because no one had really been through one. So last year, led with that spending in on-prem, that left retailers with excess inventory. And so, but then this year, I see more balance between off-prem and on-prem. And perhaps it's an opportunity to celebrate the home cocktail party. The cocktail party, it has special significance to Discus. Um, and then, the other thing we're going to touch on is, it's kind of it's an opportunity to revel in your provenance as a brand, and to work with your wholesalers to get that provenance and brand celebration with your smaller and more independent retail partners. And we'll talk a little bit about the channel shifts that have happened in BevAlc retail in a couple of slides from here. I'd say that in-home inventory stocks are hard to assess, how much is left in terms of that built up liquor cabinet at home, and how much am I burning through that when, if I got a bunch of nice bottles at home, do I really need to go to the store to get a new bottle, which is part of the overhang for the group or for the industry. Wholesale levels are still too high, which we'll touch on. And then lastly, what does one comparative, what is normal? And I'll make the point that 23 and 22 are really nonsense in terms of comparatives. So kind of looking at the 2020 to 23 off-prem engagement in the category, it was really up for larger players and grocery mass, and smaller independents, lost some share. And we'll talk about why that's really why that happened, but also that it's probably not a good thing for the industry because before the pandemic, despite big boxes' advantages of being able to get better pricing and having efficient buying groups and having superior consumer insight teams versus a local independent that has one person as his insights. In general, independent, the smaller operators largely maintained and grew their business. They didn't grow as fast as the big quote unquote category killers, and super regionals, but they were able to still grow their business. And the reason is it's a durable category, so um, it has good margins, and so that kind of allows the smaller operators to withstand competitive encroachment and recessions and changes. Economic rents. I mean, everybody does well in this industry, so people like that. There's a dynamic in terms of sway of local relevant selection and curation, and there's value in that knowledgeable salesperson to help one navigate, a breadth of selection on the shelves. And then generally in terms of the overall retail category, it's really heavily levered to the spirits category, which is really where the dollar volume and value is created. And so the question I kind of pose is, can the retail industry return to its prior status? And everything that I'm sharing in I've done quite a large report on the retail category as it relates to BevAlc. And if you reach out to Amy, that presentation and report can be, disseminated. But
Yeah, if I can, let me just Thomas, I think at some point we're going to have to shift to the takeaways.
yep,
But I will just say, because somebody posted they wanted to know in the chat, um, Thomas, we will include, so this whole webinar series we'll send the link out to everyone who registered for this webinar, and then it will be also posted on the Discus YouTube channel, so you'll be able to access this. And you'll be able to access Thomas's contact information if you want to follow up with questions, because somebody had a specific question about the Washington, D.C. area in terms of how to access Placer AI's services. But I think they can maybe contact you directly on that. And then another question, maybe just really quickly before you move on to the takeaways, just remind people how you gained access to tracking the smartphones and the data. So sort of going back to the earlier, how does Placer AI work?
because there's an app where somebody's
Yeah.
double opting to have their location tracked because they get a benefit for that. In the case of Fitbit or Apple Watch or Progressive or Allstate, or hundreds of different apps that people get a benefit for having their location tracked, or they want them to understand, where they're going, et cetera. So that's where we can obtain the
Yeah.
data.
There's an opt-in in an app that somebody has chosen to
Yeah,
opt into
and
sharing their
multiple,
data, essentially.
multiple. And it's probably like 10 on top in your phone right now.
Yeah.
To kind of try to quickly get to the takeaway. So again, this is looking at the spirits category, off-prem consumer expenditure 19 through 23. The industry grew 37%. 24% of that came from mix, meaning better quality liquids, 11% price, and per discus 0% volume. And if we break the retail channel between or that consumer expenditure between grocery, convenience, mass, and the retail, like the liquor store channel, that's this right here. This is grocery, convenience, mass. So, and then this is the share of the BevAlc retail channel of total consumption. So you can see we've been trending down. Then we came down quite abruptly during the pandemic. The grocery mass grew on a dollar expenditures 9%. The channel only grew at 3%. So we're putting more consumption into this channel, which has consequences for the industry. So, and then if we look at just the retail, BevAlc retail channel, so the top 5 chains within the channel in 19, they were about 7.2%, or 7.2 billion, or 12.7% of that channel. That has grown by 200 basis points So they grew at 10% versus 19 in terms of growth versus 5% for the smaller independent chains or locations. So, there's a shift. So this right here, this is an opportunity. And that January presentation I shared, how to identify what are those locations where you have opportunity, if you will, in terms of growth and describing your brand provenance and history and qualities. This is like another way of looking at it. So this is the top 5 chains, and looking at, seasonality. And, those, if you look at here, like 19 versus 22 versus pre-pandemic, I mean, they've gained across the year. So it's not, one given part of the year. It's really all seasons and all holidays. So has significance going forward. Looking at it regionally, um, you can see that from a regional perspective, there's really been no diminution this year on year. For any of the in any given month for any given region. We're pretty consistent. So where the industry has slowed, it hasn't slowed for the main guys. It's slowed, or for the large players, it's slowed for the smaller players.
Yes.
And then
And if,
getting
but
into
Thomas, if we move on a second, yes, and we will, to Thomas's point about his January presentation, when we send out the link to this presentation, we'll include the earlier one as well.
and then so to speak to wholesalers, which is wholesaler inventories have been very dramatic over the last 2 years and affected the ship in or what producers are able to sell. And then, so what I'm showing you here is their overall inventory levels, as reported by the Census Bureau, and this includes not just spirits, but it includes beer as well. And you can see inventory levels are still high, and inventory sales levels are still high. So if you were to assume that they sell out 2% per year to retailers, and they were to try to bring their inventory to the sales level back to kind of pre-pandemic levels, you're looking at it, down really for the remainder of this year. So this is, manufacturers selling into the wholesale channel. If you take these assumptions, you're looking at down. And then this is just to make the point of, 22 and 23 are kind of unprecedented years and not really good benchmarks. And this is looking at just visits to Kohl's. I just throw up Kohl's here as a kind of an example of a discretionary retailer. And there's a lot of noise on this, and that's intentional because you had 22, you had a period where you were coming out of the pandemic, and then you went into a recessionary fears and monetary tightening and higher interest rates. And then as we were get into 23, we have this shift into thriftiness and is fashionable and trade into lower end, and you have prioritizing spending versus on funds. So the whole point of all this is that, these are not good periods to compare yourself and think about, the health of your business. There's a lot of noise there. So the primary takeaways of all of this, I think, are, one is, the consumer is spending, but the mindset is to get value for that expenditure. A big part of that uh, desire for thriftiness and to find value is grocery prices, and so the high level grocery prices. So if grocery prices were to decline and actually go negative, that would set up be a big catalyst for consumer spending and sentiment. And I would assume that would also carry over to the BevAlc industry. The engagement for BevAlc remains, and there's an opportunity to take advantage of that engagement.
So Thomas, let me just
Yeah,
interrupt. Sorry to interrupt a second.
yeah,
We have a question. So given the focus on value, when you're talking about the previous slides
yeah.
and for the, I guess the higher income consumers, what impact do you see on the craft and premium brands?
Yeah, I mean, you really have to emphasize, what the value that's in that bottle, the value of that liquid. It's, really, leaning on your storytelling and those who can tell your story. And so that kind of gets into this thing that I've been pointing to, that independent retail is an opportunity for the industry. It's also a risk. So the independents are where the industry, makes, most of its profits. Um, and it's where that storytelling and that, curation and the as I said, the operator, the owner, he understands the market, the trade area, and he can persuade and really communicate to the visitors to that retail location.
Sure. And also, Thomas, is it fair to
Hmm.
assume that bigger chains have seen growth as they are perceived by consumers to offer better value versus the smaller
That
players or
that's
smaller retail?
Yeah, I mean, that will be a part of that shift where people are driving, as that we talked about in grocery, people are driving around visiting multiple different banners to try to find the value that they're seeking out value. So that gives advantage to the large grocery and retail operators and the mass operators, because people are willing to do that extra drive. But during the pandemic, you had this trip consolidation, and also into primary venues where people cut out um, auxiliary trips. That's part of that loss of share by the independents. I think there's a bit of a normalization where people are willing to visit more retail venues to get the value or to get the salesmanship and help them navigate, what can be a more complex category.
So,
So,
and
and
we're,
then with
go ahead.
within lower end consumer, that's obviously the less affluent consumer. That's a non sequitur, right? That's not going to happen. But for higher income households and for higher income consumers, that is a possibility.
So, we are running short of time. So I want to say before we get to the last question that's in the chat, I just want to remind you because it sort of relates. Our next webinar is going to be May 21st, and we're going to be looking into e-commerce with the CEO of Reserve Bar. So when we talk about, how to get your stories, when Thomas mentioned storytelling about the premium brands, I think the CEO of Reserve Bar, Derek Correa, will be able to help people think through that May 21st. And then on June 4th, Discus Academy is hosting a webinar, Alcohol Advertising and Marketing, How to Market Your Brands Legally and Responsibly, because that goes along with, the storytelling. So I just wanted to put a plug in for those. I think those might be very valuable to folks that are on the call. And then let me just get if there's any other questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat or in the Q&A or raise your hand. But there is one question that's, are the majors like Diageo, Brown-Forman, Sazerac, Pernod, Constellation, Gallo, et cetera, using Placer AI stats more for on or off premise or even a mix of them?
Um, there's if We did a presentation a little bit in January and then back at Discus in Chicago. And so it's the way I'm positioning and selling and Placer to the brands is using Placer as a way to create connectivity between your on and your off-prem venues. And so that enables a level of storytelling that really previously didn't exist. And then also a way to communicate with audiences that are visiting your distillery, in the case of Destination Distillery, and better being able to communicate and focus that storytelling and sets and marketing materials, into the venues, be they on or off premise, that really matter. So it's allowing you for greater efficiency and more focus to really knock it out of the park in terms of your storytelling. So that's it. So it's a little bit of a complicated question. There's a lot of data, and it's really that you can obviously get from Nielsen IQ or CGA. It's really creating that what we bring to the table really is allowing you to create that communication, that connectivity between on and off and DTC and your retail or on-prem venues.
So we will, when we send the link to this recording out to all registrants, we'll include, Thomas, your email so that people can follow up with you directly.
Yeah, yeah.
But do you have any final words before we close out?
This is my last little cheeky one on the slide here. Is I've never been through a pandemic, and I've never come out of a pandemic. And coming out of a pandemic, and we've learned can be somewhat at times as challenging as being in a pandemic. And so, and of course, that nor have you. So it's kind of,
Yeah.
I think at this point, really, historical precedent is the only logical operating assumption, and we kind of hopefully don't never have to go back to that period.
Right. The party never lasts forever, but then again, so does the hangover doesn't last forever either. So
Yeah,
we'll
exactly.
eventually sort back to some sort of equilibrium there. With that, Thomas, thank you so much. You always give such great insights in terms of trends and looking sort of what's happening now. It's looking what happened earlier, and that helps people, I think about what might be happening in the future or what might happen in the future. So appreciate you coming on board and of course, we'll probably do something with you again in January so we can recap what actually happened in the second half of 2024 once it actually happens. But I want to thank everyone else for joining us today for the Ask the Experts webinar series hosted by Discus. Like I said, we will send the link to this webinar and the earlier January webinar to all registrants after probably later this week. And if you have any other suggestions of webinar topics or questions about Discus or about Discus membership, please feel free to contact us at membership@distilledspirits.org. The webinar is now concluded, so everyone may disconnect, but we look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Thank you.